Well, welcome to another Tell Me a Story, brought to you by the Friend of the Sandwich Town Archives. Today is Thursday, January 9th. I'll tell you, it's really cold out. Although what's happening right now, too, I think is on everybody's minds, is the forest fire in Los Angeles, which is just horrid. But we're safe here. We'll say a prayer for them. Yep. And I am with Charlie Van Buskirk, who is a native of Sandwich, whose ancestors go way back, and Charlie will be talking about that. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Look forward to this for a long time.
Yes, I too. We finally got you.
Right. 2025, here I am.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Charlie, perhaps we can start with how and where and when your Van Buskirk ancestors came to Cape Cod and where they first located before coming to Sandwich.
Well, my first original ancestor came over quickly. I'll do this to New York City when it was New Amsterdam in 1655.
Huh?
And I believe his name was Lorenz Andriessen. He was Dutch. He was born in Holstein. It was Denmark at the time, but became Germany. And the EN, the Danish man, told me was Dutch versus ON, so I'm sure it was. And somewhere along the line in New York, he added Van Buskirk to his name. Lorenz Andriessen Van Buskirk. Van Buskirk means church in the woods. And it might be his mother's maiden name or grandmother, and they were from the Frisian Islands.
How interesting.
That's all we know.
Yes.
And he came here. He married a widow with 4 sons and had a carpentry shop and a drapery shop. And when the Indian affairs got loosened up, they moved to Hackensack, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
And again, he had 4 sons, so they went everywhere. But the deal is anybody with the name Van Buskirk is related. He's the only man that came here with that name.
Well, he named himself, actually.
Well, yeah,
sure.
He added
his name. Yes.
So he then became Lorenz, basically Van Buskirk. So
now you said he had 4 children. Were one
boys.
of those 4 boys? One of those your grandfather?
Yeah, girls too.
Okay.
And then that worked down. And by the time of the Revolutionary War, one of my relatives was a lieutenant colonel in the Jersey Greens. Jersey Greens was the local outfits, 4 regiments of New Jersey people that were loyalists. So he was active in the Hackensack Valley and different places. And after the Revolutionary War, he got ran out. He got asked to leave in 1783. He headed for Nova Scotia. And the family and he were given land in the Annapolis Valley. That's where the French people were vacated from and moved out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where they were. And then around the turn of the century, late 1800s, they filtered back. And an uncle of my grandfather's, an older uncle, came to Somerville, New Jersey, and he ran farms and things like that. And my grandfather, came down to live and work with him. And he met my grandmother. And he was 10 years older. She was 17. He was 27. But they eloped with people. I mean, they have certificates and stuff.
Now, let me ask, your grandfather's name and your grandmother's name, Charlie.
My grandfather's name was Ernest Edward Van Buskirk.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the youngest of at least 8 kids. My grandmother, so obviously he came from Nova Scotia. And my grandmother was from Prince Edward Island, and her maiden name was, I believe it was Elizabeth Evangeline Truesdale or Trousdale.
Okay.
The deal is they said trousers were trousers and stuff like this, but I think it's Trousdale with a W.
Okay.
And they got married and started having kids. They lived worked from, my father was born in North Andover, and they worked their way down and lived in Bellingham. And at the time, the Coonamessett Ranch was being put together in
You say the Coonamessett Ranch.
Coonamessett Ranch. And the other people that bought all of Falmouth and all what is now Camp Edwards and Otis Air Force Base and all this. And they had basically itinerant farm. They bought farms, and they had itinerant farmers. My grandfather's was a teamster, but he was also a farmer. So in 1918, in January, they moved from Hatchville. My Aunt Viola, who remembers this very well, in January, moved over to what they call the Boyden farm on Couture Road. That eventually developed into the big RV camp on Peters Pond.
Yes.
So this is how they got there. They started here and left and came back, and there they were. And there were 8 kids in that family. My father was the second oldest.
Now, may I ask, at the Coonamessett Ranch, what did your grandmother and your grandfather do? What were their jobs? Why did they come there?
When they were in Hatchville, my grandmother used to cook for the field hands, and they'd serve 20 or 30 men big lunches, and they were the guys that scythed the fields and, did all that heavy work. And she would do that, do all the baking and all. And about every 2 years had another baby. And so they came over to the Boyden farm, and my grandfather ran what my aunt called the big hennery. It was for chickens that lay eggs. And she remembers the truck coming down every morning down Couture Road to pick up the eggs and pick them up and sell them. So that was the idea of Coonamessett Ranch, was a farming, productive enterprise.
Yes.
Okay. And
so your grandfather brought that to the Boyden farm.
Yeah. When he came to the Boyden farm and took over that farm, then he did the hennery, and he also raised cows, and they had 1 year, I think I told you, they raised I think it was 500 pigs, baby pigs, for the Coonamessett Ranch. And they had the fenced-in fields and stone walls and all, and ditch fences where they plow up big things and then put the wood on top so the animals can't get out. And they did that. And
now, you mentioned your grandmother. How many children did she have? Did she end up having?
She ended up having 8 live children. And one time, my Aunt Viola told me that Grandma was talkative and told her about 13 pregnancies.
Wow.
And the last child was a baby brother named Robert. And Viola was over working at Coonamessett Ranch at the age of 12, got a telephone call. So you have a brand new baby brother. And then she got another call that the baby had died.
Oh, dear.
So my grandfather built a coffin. My father and his 2 brothers put the baby in the wagon and took it to, I think, the Toby Cemetery. That's part of the big field that they have the flea markets in.
Yes.
And buried him in an unmarked grave there. But I did look up, and there is a birth certificate. And
there is.
And a death record for him.
Do we know about what time? That was Robert. Do we know about what time?
Could have been about 1920.
Okay.
I think. And I don't really recall the exact date, but I know. And every 2 years, and my last aunt, the youngest aunt, Babe, but she then later said, no, I wanted to be called Betty, not Babe. And Wagner, and she probably was born in 18, and he was born 2 years later.
Now, you told me something very interesting. Of course, with the 8 living children, you told me something very interesting, that the oldest child.
Yes.
And this was quite common. Could you tell that story?
Right. She was born in 1902. And
her name was Charlie?
Myrna Pearl, to Van Buskirk.
Yes.
And she was sort of farmed out, you might say, to one of my grandfather's sisters, who lived in Boston, was childless, and he was the youngest, so she'd be quite a bit older, perhaps. And her husband was Sanford Orne. He owned a milk company, so they lived quite well. And so Aunt Myrna went and lived. She was raised by her aunt. And
you say that wasn't unusual, so with a
not
large
unusual
family.
at all. And then I said, one time I asked her, what was it like on the farm? She said, I wasn't on the farm. I was in Boston. But we'd come down every year for a couple of weeks, and she ran around barefoot like all the other kids. And but then went back to Boston and put on her patent leather shoes and pinafores and took piano and dance lessons and whatever. So
Well, she was quite, unlike the other 7 children, she was quite citified. You were all like,
very
yeah,
citified.
farm kids.
But she was a rough, tough
She was.
lady.
Even at that, yeah.
A lot like my grandmother, I would say. And one of the things with her, other than that, she became a nurse.
Oh, she did.
And all my father's 4 sisters were nurses. And I don't know about Myrna, whether she was a registered nurse or not, but the other 3 were. And Grandma made sure they got good occupations in case they had to take care of 8 kids by themselves, too.
Sure.
And her husband was a strong, healthy man, but at the age in his early 50s, he started to go downhill. He just started to fade. And he got arthritis. They were looking for things. They pulled all his teeth out, just to stem this if they could.
Yes, yeah.
And when he died at 56 in August of 1931, my Aunt Viola was a freshly registered nurse out of St. Luke's Hospital. And she was at the Cape Cod Hospital with Dr. Beale and I don't know, another doctor, but his name was part of the family for years. And they did a limited autopsy. And they found no evidence of cancer. And some of my uncles thought that he had cancer, but they didn't know. But she said, I was there, and I got the results of this autopsy, and he did not have cancer. He just, big, strong, healthy man, 6'2", just faded away. And that was the end. Grandma was sitting there with 7 kids.
So, one of those, of course, being your father.
Yep.
Can we talk about him a little bit, Charlie?
Yep.
Your father,
Ernest Reginald Van Buskirk.
Aha.
And when he came here in, I guess it was January 1918, of course, he went to the Sandwich Academy. The high school was called the Academy, up on Academy Hill.
Yep.
By Champond. And he used to ride his horse to school. That's the other way he could get there. And
From South Sandwich. He would ride his horse to Academy.
Yeah.
Okay.
And his nickname became Pancho Villa because that was when the Spanish-American War was going on. Here he's coming every day with a horse. Now, I don't really know. In January, February, you don't leave it out in the field. You probably took it to Boyden's barn and let it there, then feed it and water it, and go get it and ride home. And it wasn't, I don't know how Alvin Crocker and all those people from Forestdale got there, but they did talk about a barge. And a barge was a horse-drawn wagon that they took the kids to school in. But they didn't come by Cotuit Road. So that's where my father rode. And the rest of the kids went to the South Sandwich School or Farmersville School.
But your father came all the way into...
he was in high school.
Okay.
And the others went to the Farmersville School, which is right across from Percival Road. In Percival, it was right there. My older sister remembers it as a building. I never do. But so later, my grandmother, she fought for, again, my aunt remembers the truck that used to come and get the eggs, okay? So there were vehicles now. And she fought for a school bus, and a school bus that would take her kids to school, and the Hoxie kids and everybody else.
That was in South Sandwich.
Yeah, right.
The Burks, the Hoxie,
and, there was some dissension because she was a Dover PEI person, Prince Edward Island. They were potato farmers and all that. Grandma liked to drive teams of horses. She was an outdoor girl. I mean, pitch hay and do that. Yeah. And served her well later on. And So Mr. Burke was saying, oh, well, she isn't even a citizen. What is she? We're spending money here. We're going to buy, the Ellises are going to get a bus and buses.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you that. So, do you, the term barge, of course, when I was interviewing Mrs. Cullity, Rosanna Cullity, she mentioned that in East Sandwich, where they lived, a barge came and picked them up. And that confused me at first. Well, a barge is a bus, a bus.
Yeah, or a big wagon.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
Of interest, when they got the bus, Mr. Burke, the one who said she's trying to spend our money or whatever, he became bus driver.
The bus driver.
He became in charge of the bus.
Okay.
So now my father said that Mr. Burke was all dirt roads, and Mr. Burke would, coming home or going, if he went through a muddy spot and got stuck or slowed down, the high school, the big boys had to get out and push.
Of course.
So they're running through mud up to their ankles. But the hard part on spring days, or could be cold, wet, all, was he wouldn't stop the bus until he got on firm ground. So he could ride that bus a half a mile down the road before he stopped, and the boys had to run and head up to get back on the bus.
Because, as you say, a lot of them were dirt roads back then.
They had to get out and push.
Yeah.
And, of course, then they started paving 130 and all, and oiling and doing roads and stuff.
Now, after he graduated from high school.
Right.
What did he do after that, Charlie?
He was encouraged by some of the, I guess you'd say, wealthy estate or homeowners in Wakeby and places like that he did work for, and they encouraged him to get further education. He was smart enough to get it. So he went to New York City and enrolled in Pace Institute, which was downtown near the City Hall, is where that was located. And he worked at a hotel. He lived and worked at a hotel, the Essex Hotel. And at Pace Institute, he studied engineering, which was actually, some of it was road construction as well as heating and all that engineering. Interestingly enough, he made it for 2 years there and then couldn't afford it, whatever.
Sure.
But at the Essex Hotel, this is Prohibition time, and he was 6'1" or 6'2", and he weighed like 150 pounds when he went down there. I saw it right in his notes. And the cooks in the kitchen, he got along good with them, and the cook would tell him, Reggie, he said, stop by later, and the cook would make him a nice big roast beef sandwich and all, and hand it to him. That's how he did.
That was where he met his wife.
He didn't get
your mother.
Oh no, not yet.
Okay.
He couldn't get room and board. I mean, he was on his own,
yes.
eating and all. So he survived quite nicely. And part of the deal is all kinds of people come and go in this hotel. And he used to go up and have to fix the radiators that were leaking and all. So you might be anywhere and meet anybody.
Mm-hmm.
But you know nothing. You see nothing, you know nothing, you say nothing, because who knows? Prohibition, you know? And so he got through that okay. And he came back to the Cape, and he started a landscaping, construction, land clearing business and all.
Mm-hmm.
And he evidently was quite successful, because in about 1928, he bought himself, he knew my mother by then, he bought himself a nice little Model A Ford Roadster. And the one with all the bells and whistles, little camp item, probably was a soft top. I mean, it was really a nice car. And in the meantime, since he had worked all around Peters Pond, and there was a place over there called the Forestdale Lodge. Forestdale Lodge, eventually, by 1950, and had been there since the mid-1800s or so.
And where was that located, John?
On Peters Pond, and it is now part, where the location was, is part of the big sand pit.
Oh, all right. Okay, sure. Yeah.
And my mother's great aunt and uncle, her aunt and uncle, bought that place. And he was Charles Abbott. He was an entrepreneur. And he also ended up buying the Old Silver Beach Lodge and running that as well. And he did that. And my father used to set up goose camps on Wakeby Lake. That's where they could have the live geese with the clipped wings swimming, and then call the other geese in and shoot them and stuff. He did all that. And that's when my mother and her sister used to come down to visit their aunt.
Okay.
And that's where he met my mother.
Because he was working at...
He did work for the Abbott, Charlie Abbott. And
Okay.
Charlie Abbott was from California. He was an MIT graduate. His family were cabinet makers, fine cabinets and stuff. So he knew that work. And he was an electrical engineer at MIT, and he was an entrepreneur. So anywhere there was cash, he was in on it. So he used to have these little radios put together, $15 maybe, and then put them in a cabinet, and he sold them for $100. Versus people used to do their own little radios and stuff. But
so now, the Forestdale Lodge, you had shared with me that eventually became known as the Alibi Lodge. Was that just sort of like a commonly known? That's what commonly people called it, or was it actually named that?
It was named Alibi Lodge.
Isn't that a strange name?
And there was a bar down there, and it was way down a wooden dirt road. And it was very secluded, and who knows when Uncle Charlie Abbott ran it during Prohibition.
Oh, well,
that
okay.
ended in 1933, what went on there.
I gotcha.
My mother never said.
Yes.
My father never said, but you don't know.
The time was right.
And the Old Silver Beach place, and if the stuff was going on, and Charlie Abbott could have been in on it.
Sure.
I mean, on the part that he would have champagne for people and this stuff, make money.
Now, it's interesting because your father going to Pace Institute, you said that he took up engineering. That set him up well for his professional job in Sandwich, didn't it?
Yes. He became road surveyor in 1938. In 1931 or 2, he ran. And it was one of these things. It maybe was like this last election where the incumbent road surveyor, you ran every year for this, was well entrenched, but it was a flip. And of course, then the current road surveyor and his supporters got together and got him out the next year. But he kept running. And by 1938, he won, and he kept that job running election every year. And then finally it went to 3 years in about 1950. And every year he did that until 1972. And
so your father was highway surveyor.
Yeah, road surveyor.
Road surveyor.
From
1938 to 1972.
Yeah.
That's remarkable because, as you say, he had to run for election.
There weren't that many people in Sandwich, and maybe 500-600 voters. And some years he'd win by a couple of hundred votes, and some years he'd win by 8 votes. A lot of it depended on what happened in March when the big snowstorms hit and stuff. If he didn't get the roads all clean, there was a lot of griping about, oh, they plowed me in. Oh, they backed over and collapsed my cesspool. Oh, they did this, they did. And so it was pretty funny. Fortunately, construction companies knew him, and they always said, Reggie, you got a job with me. If you don't get that election, you got a job right here. And there was 2 or 3 of them, I would say.
Yeah, so he knew if he didn't win.
He was fortunate that he worked all through the Depression, because when they started building Camp Edwards in the mid-30s or early 30s, that he was working up there, setting up roads and the drainages and doing all that. Storm drainage and the roads and doing things like that. So he worked all through the Depression, and then in 1938 he became the surveyor. So he was very, very fortunate.
Now, people might be interested in knowing about. They didn't have a lot of equipment back then.
No.
But the town barn.
Yeah.
Could you tell us where that was located at that point?
Town barn was located behind the hardware store, which is now the McDonald's gift shops and all that right on Jarvis Street. And behind there is a big barn, which fortunately they're keeping intact. And underneath was the town barn where they had a place where they could lock the tools up. And they had a big round barrel stove they could throw wood in and heat it up.
Because there was no heat there.
In the middle of winter in a snowstorm, it was really great to go in there and dry out a little bit. Mm-hmm. And the town didn't own any equipment. They owned the road grader. The road grader was necessary because they scraped all those dirt roads. Yeah. And the other way later, too, when they started oiling roads and things, by the way, he oiled, it would be Pleasant Street in Sandwich. Mm-hmm. That was a dirt road when in 1938, when he came, he put the first oil on that one.
Did he?
Dirt roads in Sandwich, yeah,
wow.
Right in the village.
Wow.
And they owned the road grader, and they owned the snow plows. That there when people, he owned a truck. He supplied the truck to the town and rented it to them.
Uh-huh.
They didn't have to own it. They didn't have to insure it, and they didn't have to keep it running and repair it. He did. That was part of his job. And I don't know, he probably made $2,500 a year doing a road surveyor.
Now tell me, your mother.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your mother a little.
Yes. Interesting lady.
Yes, I remember her well.
She was one of 4 people. There was a blonde, blue-eyed girl, the older sister, who could play the piano and sing, and she could type 70 words a minute on an old-fashioned typewriter with the carbon papers and not make a mistake. Pretty remarkable. My mother went to secretarial school as well. She could do shorthand. She could do all this stuff and type and do. Not as good as my sister, but what my mother could do was dance. She started off being a babysitter for a young girl, Mrs. O'Grady's daughter, and Mrs. O'Grady ran a dance school.
Excuse me, Charlie, this isn't Boston.
Boston, yeah.
Yep.
Mother was born in Somerville, and they lived in Boston in rented apartments and stuff. They didn't earn anything.
Thank you.
And she had another brother. My mother was dark-haired and fast, very fast. When she was 10 years old, they used to import 14-year-old guys from the other neighborhoods to race with her between telephone poles. Sprint. So maybe it's only 50 yards, but they bring 14-year-olds in to try to beat her.
Yeah.
And then her next brother was dark-haired, and he was fast, too. He went to BC High School, Boston College High School, and he was a sprinter. And he became a Jesuit priest. And then the other brother was red-haired, blue-eyed, and he was in the Army, seemed like for a long time. He came home late because he went in late, but he stayed 46, 47, because during the Reconstruction period, he was in France and Belgium, and he was a truck driver, transport guy.
Now, you've shared with me that your mom had a real talent.
Yep.
In dance, and that was discovered early in her childhood.
Mrs. O'Grady used to watch my mother teach. Mrs. O'Grady would be teaching. My mother would pick it up and teach Mrs. O'Grady's daughter all the steps, tap and all. She did ballet. She did all that stuff. So Mrs. O'Grady also put together summer road shows to go up and go to the resorts up in Sebago Lake, Maine and New Hampshire, family resorts. And so she had a family road show of entertainment and dancing and all this stuff. And they did it. She did it for several years and went all the way to Nova Scotia. And so she really learned her trade. And I mentioned that one of the people in the troupe was Ray Bolger. So she knew Ray Bolger personally. She said one time he even stole a kiss from her. And then she and her chums, when my mother she was actually 17, and the Marx Brothers opened a show in Philadelphia called Coconuts, and it was going to be a Broadway road show type thing, and it didn't have a good review. They moved it to Boston, and they were looking for extra dancers, and my mother and three of her chums, as she said, that all could dance and knew each other and all that stuff. They went down and tried out, and they were accepted.
All of them.
And the reason they could go was because they had permission to do it because they could all go together and stay together. Well, this road show was very successful, and it traveled all over the country for a year. She went to Toledo, Ohio, Chicago, Denver, Colorado, California. She has pictures of the Rose Day Parade, the Rose Bowl Parade.
Oh, sure, yes.
And all the way back home. And it was quite an experience, and I have a picture of all the cast in front of a theater in Denver that it's not there anymore. And Groucho wrote, "To Dottie, my best dancer," and I called Little Wiggly was his nickname for her.
Yeah,
because when they had specialty dances, when something's going on, we've got 3 or 4 dances out there as part of it with the Marx Brothers doing their shtick, and she was always one of them. And so they knew each other quite well. And real quick, in fact, after she got married and had my older sister, Ruth Ann, the Marx Brothers heard about it and sent her a baby carriage that would be like a Cadillac.
Oh, my
baby
gosh.
carriages today.
Sure.
So my sister Carolyn rode in it, and I rode in it, and we'd go all the way to the boardwalk, and I'd be in the baby carriage for a year and a half, 2 years, just smothered with stuff. My sister would be 3 years old, walking along, whining, "He's in the carriage."
Yeah, how come I can't be in the carriage?
So things like that.
So you end up,
Yeah.
your mother and father, and after a few different places that they lived in Sandwich, your father was able to buy the house on School Street,
Yep.
number 4 School Street. Tell us about that.
During the Depression, it was really hard to find a place to live. So you rented a house here, wherever you could get in, you did. One year they spent the whole year on at one of LaBelle's cottages or house in East Sandwich Beach.
Sure.
Big cold winter and all, but it had a flushing toilet and it had everything. And so my mother says, "Reg, if we ever move or whatever, I want to live in the village where I can walk to the store, I can walk to the post office, I can walk to church, and live sort of a civilized life and not out there having chickens and splitting wood and things like it." And so he came up the street one day, and at 4 School Street, didn't have numbers then, he saw a little sign in the bushes, and he got out and looked, and it said, "For sale." So he looked into it. Now, that was tough. It was 1941, and interest rates were like 16%. So I think he got the house for maybe $4,000, and I think he had a couple thousand to put in on it, but not enough. My aunt and uncle, the nurse, the DeGraws that later took over the RV.
Viola.
Yep.
Yep.
And Andy loaned him money. I don't know if it's $800. I don't know the prices of the house.
Sure.
And they were very good. So we got into the house, and I wasn't born yet. They moved in July of 41. I was born from that house on October 18th in 1941. When my father went in, there was a hand pump in the kitchen to an artesian well, no running water. No outhouse, 15 by 15 woodshed, and a nice pine-paneled 2-holer in the house that you hired the honey wagon man to come and shovel out, pick up, and empty in the orchards or whatever he did. And so my father he put in a septic and a cesspool and running water and a pump. The house had been electrified in 1926.
Do you have an idea as to when it was built, Charlie?
Yes. On the records, it would show like 1835. But that's when they tore off part of the old house and put a front addition on it.
Mm-hmm.
The back house, the back part, still had the fieldstone laid, foundation, but when they did the house, they put a lot of brick around it.
Mm-hmm.
Inside, you could see it. And I think some of the fieldstone, when they built the front part of the house, they made the base of the chimney, because I think it would be brick or something, but it was all fieldstone, and I took that from the foundation and did that with it, and had a round brick dirt cellar for vegetables.
Well, that's typical
stuff.
of an old Cape house,
The old part had 5 fireplaces in it, so it was really meant for heating. And the key part that I figured out later, it had a beehive oven.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't the old type where it was right facing part of the fireplace with a door like the Nye house, because that was built in the 1600s. So this is why I think the house was around 1790. That part, it was either moved there or built there. Couldn't go back too far because the records for Sandwich were burnt in the Barnstable County fire.
Yes.
So he couldn't go back. But he did know we were the 3rd family that ever owned the house. The Fish family owned it. And after that, he bought it from the Armstrongs. But they weren't local Armstrongs. They were people who manufactured vitreous sinks and toilets and stuff like that. So it was people with,
So you were only the 3rd owner, your family.
Third owner in the house, I'd say definitely goes back to 1790, 1800. Because by 1825, they weren't putting Dutch ovens in anymore. Not Dutch, but beehive ovens, because they started getting stoves and stuff, and particularly the city people and people with money. Cape Cod is always at the end of it,
Yeah.
So, but it was put in with cabinetry covering it. So you open these doors, and there was the Dutch oven, and they had a metal grates and stuff, so you could open it up. Underneath was the box where you kept the kindling wood, throw it in there, get it up to heat, rake out the coals, take the goose wing and sweep out the ashes, and then just bake your ovens, bake your stuff.
Can you imagine?
And it was
we turn on a dial to cook out things now.
Buttons.
I know. Can you imagine? I know.
We never used it, because when my father moved into the house, this is why I know it's a lot older. The floors were very worn. They were the white pumpkin pine floors, and they were very worn and cupped. So it had been used for quite a while. And when he moved in, he put oak hardwood floors, both in the downstairs kitchen and upstairs. We called it the old kitchen, because there was a back stair thing that went up into that area. And that was another kitchen up there, because at different times, 2 families or more, 2 families anyway, lived in the house.
So, you and your 2 sisters, Ruth Ann and Carolyn, you being the youngest, grew up in town.
Yes.
Can we sort of reminisce about some of the things that you experienced growing up in town? For instance, you shared with me that your family would shop at Alvizi's store. Grocery store, yeah.
She could walk. We go to Russell's too.
Oh, well, it does. No.
The point was that they didn't put supermarkets in until Buzzards Bay had one in about 1950, and then Hyannis had them and stuff.
So can you,
but my mother didn't drive.
Yeah. So can you remember A.B. Alvizi and Walter Alvizi?
Oh.
Can you share? Yeah. What did the store look like? I mean,
it was the brick front store.
Yeah.
I've seen some.
It was right on Java Street. Now that was I don't quite. I'll look for it in my notes, but you keep on going.
It was by Alice Hall.
Alice Halls, yeah.
Which is now it's the Chris.
Oh, it's 2 Java Street.
Yeah, 2 Java.
2 Java Street. Okay.
Chris, the one that bought the house next door.
Chris Wilson.
And the church and the belfry and all, and he bought that.
So if you walked into the store back then, what would you see? What would the store be like?
Well, you would walk in, and over this way in front of facing it, the left-hand front window would be the counter where the Minnie Winterstrom would write down your weekly charges, or anytime you went to the store, my father would go back once a month and pay it.
Yeah, everything was on credit, wasn't it? Yeah. Yep.
And sometimes if my father wasn't in a good mood, or he thought the people weren't saying nice things about him, he'd what do you call it, passive aggressive. They'd ask, Minnie would say, Doc, when's Reggie coming in to pay the bill, you know? And my mother would be so embarrassed that she had to be asked that. She'd go home and tell my father, and he said, oh, I'll get there. But he'd hold off, and then he'd go pay the bill.
Well, you know, just to, you know, the Alvises, Al Hoy, my grandfather,
and Al Hoy's,
Bill Russell.
I remember your grandfather.
Freddie Alvise. I don't know that the town who had the oil, I don't know that the townspeople could have gotten on the way that they did during the Depression without those people that ran those stores.
They couldn't.
You know, no, they just couldn't have, Charlie. Because it was all on credit.
And after the war, I don't know about Minnie, if he was, his name was Charles. I used to say, you know, what was your name? Charles Bernard? I don't know. Charles Bernard
Winistrom, yeah.
And he said, my name is Charles. You know, I never knew that. We called him Minnie. And he was there, and Freddie had to get out of the Navy or whatever.
Freddie Alvise,
he worked there. Freddie worked there. And Walter, of course, and Abe, we called him, Caesar Alvise, Sylvia's father and Linda's father. He bought the meat, and he had a panel truck, and he'd bring the meat. And during the war, when they lived on River Street, sometimes he'd call up my father and say, I got some good meat here. So we'd go down, and he'd had a nice big roast beef. All of this stuff was like rationed.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, and of course, there was a black market going on. So A.B. had a little butcher shop underneath place, and we had some meat. And so my father and mother were good friends with A.B. and Marion, and my sister went to school with Sylvia. So,
what other stores do you remember? Well, you probably remember your mother worked at Butner's.
Later, yeah. Fourth or fifth grade, she went to work. My father did not want her working. He did not want her to be like some of the other mothers and go down and clean cottages and stuff like that. So the story is my oldest sister's the one that always talks about it. My mother said I needed a new coat. And, you know, what's wrong with the old one? You know, I needed a new coat. And meanwhile, I think it was Mrs. either Dents or Eunice Cheval had worked with Katie Maley at Butner's.
Mm-hmm.
And she retired. She was leaving. I mean, she couldn't do it anymore. So Katie asked my mother, because we all went to the same church. We all knew each other. Katie asked my mother, Dorothy, would you come work for us? And of course, my mother being a Paulette secretary and all, she wanted it. So finally, my father said, well, Dot, if you need a new coat, I guess you go to work, get one, buy one.
So that's what convinced him that you should go to work.
That was perfect. I mean, you work in a millinery store. It smelled so good. You walk in there, the old guy that used to take care of it for Butner's, he'd oil the floors every year, had a big furnace with a big round hole that the hot air came up in, and it smelled always like perfume and powder.
Is that what they sold?
And
one of the things they
sold girls and all of that. They sold kids' clothes up to about the age of 5.
You know, for many years, I think that Butner's, which years prior to that, it had been Bartley's store, which again was a clothing store, but Butner's really was the only place in Sandwich for many years that especially women could get their clothes, unless they wanted to go to Fall River or New Bedford.
Bedford was big. Hyannis on Saturdays, and everybody walked up. I got my shoes there, Leans. We walked up and down the street and met half the people from Sandwich there. Sometimes it'd be kids, and they didn't want to leave Hyannis, so we'd get up, giving them a ride home, saying, "Yeah, you can go, parents. We'll bring her home." And we go home and we'd stop at a delicatessen or whatever. We call them delicatessens. And get my father liked pig's knuckles, and he liked whitefish. We'd always get that. Plus, we'd get some real good salami and some cheese, and all that stuff.
Of course, that would be a big deal.
Yeah. And my mother from Boston knew all that stuff.
Sure. Yes.
And first time in Quincy, I went with her to a deli, And I had pastrami for the first time in my life, and 5 years old, and I remember it like, ooh, wow,
That tastes
I
good.
never knew about this. And we'd do that, and we'd go to Al Hoy, and my father always stopped in places and talked to people. Part of that was electioneering, and in a sense, so you keep contact with your so-called constituents.
Yes.
And Al was a selectman, and later Baz AB, I think, was probably a selectman.
Yes, he was.
Or
ABL Visa. Yes, he was.
Baz Noddy, I can never remember his name, that owned the Yankee Clipper. He was,
That was that Albert?
Albert ran the store.
Albert ran the store in back.
Carl ran the gas
station.
And
Isn't that awful?
that one,
I can't remember either.
they were real nice people.
Yeah.
And his wife was head of the women's club and
Yes.
stuff. So, they were.
So tell me, we have a few more minutes. Some stories that you shared with me. Maybe tell me about your best friend, Louis Gavoni.
Louis Gavoni came to the Daniel Webster Inn, the old Daniel Webster, when his father, who was ran on the head chef at the Ostable Manor, came over and started working as the head chef manager.
At the Daniel Webster.
Yeah, Daniel Webster. And his older brother, Jim, basically owned it. But I think Al had a share because their grandfather was the one that bought it, and they named it the Daniel Webster Inn. And Jim Gavoni owned 4 Java Street, that nice house, the canal office and all that.
Yeah.
The safe was still there, and worked there. And they lived and stayed there, as well as their grandmother Linda, Louis, Al's mother, and Uncle Alfred. I don't know about Alfred. He worked for Corps of Engineers, and I remember later he was up in Maine. He'd drive all the way back, and he'd go back and forth from Maine and all, and then he went over to the base as his husband.
How did you meet Louis?
Carolyn and I we could walk around our block around School Street, all up and around Water Street, down to the church and around by the library and all. We used to walk down to a little candy store next to the weather station, Fred Murray's and the weather. I think there was another house there that the Dory, D-O-R, with that E, Karen lived. And I don't know if it's related to Edgar Karen and all them or not. But they were elderly, and they had a little candy and soda, whatever. Not a fountain, just stuff.
Now, excuse me, is that the lot, the vacant lot?
Yes.
Next to the library?
I think
as you're looking at the left.
2 houses there.
That vacant lot to the left.
There was Freddie, the weather shop.
Yeah.
That's where the Karens were. He'd sit out on the front porch and take chestnuts and whittle them into little baskets and give them to you. And we go down there to buy with a nickel to buy fudgicles and popsicles. So one day Carolyn and I went down, and there was a little boy across the street was there, and he said, "Hi, can you come play?" And we couldn't cross the street, so we went home and told my mother. And they set it up that when we come down, and Molly would cross us, Carolyn and I at first.
Now, that would be Molly Gavoni. Louis' mother. Yeah, right. Okay.
And we'd all hang around there. And then later, in the next house that the inn now still owns, Phyllis Darling and her 2 older brothers came, and she went to first grade. I met her first, and my mother said she's riding up the street on a sidewalk on a tricycle. And I'm talking to her. She's a lovely girl. And my sister said, "What are you talking to her for? You don't know her," and all this. But they became great friends. Sylvia Albese, Sheila Loring, Phyllis, and all that. And she's just around for 2 years. And so Carolyn I used to play that. I played with her friends. She played with mine.
Because it was only a year apart. You and Carolyn, your sister.
Months in a grade apart. So her friends are my friends are her friends. And of course, Carolyn being so bubbly and all this stuff, she had all the friends. I just had mine. So we did that, and I became great friends with Louis, and I used to go and there all the time and play, and then they'd cross me the street, and I'd go home. So while we were there, the firehouse was in the back, the fire station, and that later became the firehouse party place. And the fire trucks were sitting there, and we were allowed to ring the bells on the old Aaron Fox or something.
Oh, no.
And I don't think one time we did the
siren?
Yeah, and Al came out and says, "The bells are okay, boys. You don't touch." And if the keys were right in them, I mean, but what we did, we just sit there, 4 or 5 years old, playing, and Louis, on the wall, Louis grew. He was a big kid, and on the wall there was a button. So if I knew of a fire and I came, there was a button up in the Daniel Webster, right by the back door.
Okay.
So if a call came in, they pushed the button.
Oh,
and
that would alert the fire station and back.
It would
Gotcha.
ring, and there were certain floor was of this, or something was a house fire or a car fire or something. And at noontime, it would ring. It would go at noon, 12 noon, the noon fire whistle. That was to tell you it was noontime, and it was also to make sure the whistle was working. Mm-hmm. Every day that went off. And Louis could touch that. He could stand on his tiptoes. He could touch that button. He never touched it, but he could.
He could.
And because we already got yelled at once for doing the siren on the truck. And the doors are always open in the summer and all. So, and we played there. And they had a handyman, real quick, Charlie Pachunk. And he spoke broken Italian. He was Yugoslavian. And he took care of the pigs because they had pigs out back from scraps from the inn. They fed the pigs. I don't know. They're probably chickens. And we'd do stuff. And he had a big fire pit, and he'd burn all the cardboard and all this stuff. One time, Louis and I went out with sticks and stuff. We stirred it up, and it came back
to a big fire?
Not a big fire, but it got burning again. Charlie had put it out. And boy, talk about a Dutch uncle yelling at you in some language. And he did it again. We didn't do it again. But we were a little bit mischievous. But men in the bottom of the inn, it was like a walkout. And a big kitchen down there and stuff, too. And Louis' grandmother, Linda, and her sisters were often there. They all speak Italian. It was interesting because 5 sisters, and then the Nini sisters, they could all read and write. And I even in my day met Italian ladies that I signed. I wrote stuff for them. Mm-hmm. I delivered prescriptions for people. They said, "Here, you do it." And which is fine. I mean, maybe they could, but they didn't feel comfortable. And so they'd be in there all baking and making the tortellini and making all this. Always smelled so good.
Oh, the Italian
always
food.
Would have something to eat.
Yes.
And they came in there. And later they moved to they moved to Jarvis Street. And Nana, Linda, and Alfred lived there. And Louis used to stay there a lot growing up during high school and all. He loved to play sports, but in the winter, for practice and all this stuff, he lived there most of the week and go back to Peter's Pond Club in the weekends.
So the house that you're talking about that you just talked about that the Gavonis owned would be the house right next to
Alpieces.
Yeah, it's owned now by Chris Wilson again.
Yeah, four jobs.
Yes,
with the stone wall.
Yes,
and the state used to put state trucks. State used to rent that garage to put trucks in. Also, on the back end of the firehouse, fire engines were in the front, and the state used to use the back.
The back, yeah.
So this is how I got to know Rudy, all the men that work for the state. And
Charlie, this has been such a joy to talk to you. I'm so glad that we were able to finally get together and share. And I know you have 1,000
I do
other stories.
And these are old. I mean, I've only gotten to 5th grade. But what I'm saying, I mean, it all ties together.
Right.
But the thing is, it's the real old stuff.
Yeah.
And
well, it's the real old stuff that is going to be lost.
Yeah, it's
and
1940s.
Now, what I'll tell you though, you're coming back in July, right?
Yes, 2 weeks.
Okay, July of 2025.
Right.
Why don't we schedule something?
I'd love to.
And it would be nice if we could get your sister Carolyn also. Would love to have her join us. Because her, it's funny in with families, the same members of the same family have different impressions of what went on. Even with the same story.
Yeah.
But we're going to close now. I want to thank you so much.
Okay.
And hopefully we'll be able to circle around and come back again.
I could do chapters 2, 3, and 4.
Okay, I know you can.
I mean, you can edit all you want. I mean, So.
I want to thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoy this film as much as I have enjoyed speaking with Charlie. And we'll see you next time with another Tell Me a Story. And I cannot leave before I thank both Brian and Paula for helping us do this video today. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.